Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to commend you all for braving the traffic. I understand there was a 4-car accident somewhere on Westheimer, and I commend you all for your persistence in getting here tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute this evening for a conversation on the transformative events in the Middle East over the past 3 years. First, I would like to thank the Middle East Institute, including Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain, Dr. Salem, and Dr. al-Anani for joining us tonight. Wendy Chamberlain I've known in my diplomatic career. She used to work in the Near East Bureau when I was in charge of that bureau. She was an outstanding younger Foreign Service officer who was in charge of the public relations of the Near East Bureau and burnished my image, which was a very difficult task. And then she went on to much greater things and became our ambassador to Pakistan in a very critical period of 2001, right after 9/11, and did an outstanding job there, and very courageous Foreign Service officer. Dr. Salem, I want to welcome Dr. Salem and Dr. Anani for joining us tonight. Again, Wendy has done a terrific job of bringing the Middle East Institute to a level where it is one of the premier organizations in Washington now devoted to better understanding in the United States of the complex Middle East region. We here at the Baker Institute look forward to collaborating with the Middle East Institute across our current research programs on women's rights, human rights, conflict resolution, Israel-Palestine, Syria, political economy in the Gulf states, and other issues involving the Levant. There's also very strong interest here at Rice University in the Houston community and beyond for quality information on these issues, and it is our goal to provide informed analysis that fosters debate and discussion on this very important region of the world. As we look to the Middle East today, we are witnessing a tectonic shift in the landscape which started in Tunisia 3 years ago this month. And if I'm not mistaken, today is the anniversary when President Ben Ali left Tunisia, exactly today, 3 years ago. So it's very appropriate that we are discussing the so-called Arab Spring at this moment. And of course, this phenomenon that started with this young man, Mohammed Bouazizi, sacrificing his own life, it just spread and traveled with dramatic effect, as you all know, to Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. And the repercussions of this shock have varied in each country and have spread with different magnitude throughout the region. In Syria, the Arab Spring has had its most, in our view, most far-reaching and tragic impact to date. It's truly a humanitarian disaster. It's a problem from hell. The world now faces the policy of a failed state collapsing in the heart of the Arab world, with implications for Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Israel, and beyond. So the turmoil of these last 3 years could be called the true end of the post-colonial period of the Middle East. In this respect, this is due to the end of many secular Arab autocratic systems, which were the legacy of Arab nationalism and those movements. In the post-World War II era, these countries became independent and regimes came to power. But, you know, it really started in Syria in 1949 with Hosni Zaim, who initiated a series of coups d'etats in Syria where military men took power and then took off their uniforms and put on civilian suits. We saw this with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world. And so we had a very tight lid of these ruling systems that now have been removed and unleash a myriad of new and old competing political forces, which our participants in the discussion today will elaborate on. There's also another impact of the end of the world, this post-colonial and World War II, and that is involving the United States. It's highlighted the Arab Spring, the increasing inability of the United States and the wider international community to influence outcomes. We can no longer direct political events in the Middle East. We've tried to in the past. We've done with failures, some successes in the past. But the United States and the international community, their influence in directing this movement is greatly diminished. In the case of the United States, this is a combination of fading interest, fatigue, and, in my view, an ambiguous strategic framework for engagement. So in spite of this muddled environment, the dangers for American disengagement from the Middle East are significant. Extremism in all its forms, in every part of this region, is spreading across state borders, fed by proxy states and sectarian tensions. So the global economy continues to depend on Middle Eastern oil despite the increased security, energy security that we are developing here in the United States and the North American continent. So even with the positive steps taken by the Obama administration in the areas of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and engagement with Iran on the nuclear issue, which I applaud, the denial of Palestinian statehood and the threat, eventually, of a nuclear-armed Iran remain key issues and possibly destabilizing threats to regional peace. So our panelists this evening have their work cut out for them. How will trends in the region continue to evolve? What should be the U.S. role, or what is it in this new Middle East? Is there any room for optimism in this bleak landscape? So I'd like to welcome our moderator for this evening, Dr. Alan Matasso, who's my Associate Director for Academic Affairs, been at my side for the last 11 years at the Baker Institute. He will introduce our two panelists, and we will begin the discussion and take it from there. Alan Matasso.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're very fortunate that our panelists today are very well qualified to talk about our subject, which is assessing the Arab Spring three years later. On my immediate right, we have Paul Salem. Both of these panelists are from the Middle East Institute, as the ambassador pointed out, which is the oldest Middle East think tank in Washington and highly respected. Dr. Paul Salem got his degrees from Harvard, his BA, his MA, his PhD. He's taught at the American University of Beirut. From 1989 to 1999, he was the founding director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, and in a very short time, that center became the premier think tank in the region. From 1999 to 2006, he was the director of the Farish Foundation. 2006 to 2013, he directed the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and in 2013, he became Vice President for Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute. He has published widely on a number of Middle Eastern subjects, but he has a special expertise in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and he's a fixture in the media when expert opinion on the region is in demand, which turns out to be almost every day. The other of our speakers is Khalil al-Anani on the far right, who got his BA and MA at the University of Cairo and earned his PhD from Durham University in the United Kingdom. He's also taught at Durham. Are you still teaching there, by the way? Or? Yeah. Dr. al-Anani's specialties are Egyptian politics, democratization, and he has a unique competence on the subject of the Muslim Brotherhood. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and has been since August of 2013, and he is also well known in the media for giving expert commentary. So what's going to happen here today is that the speakers will each talk about 10 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion here on the panel briefly. and then open it up to questions from the audience. So, Mr. Salem, would you like to start?
Thank you. I'd like to thank Ambassador Georgian and Dr. Madusau. It's a pleasure to be here at the Baker Institute. I'm trying to give a few ideas about sort of the Arab transitions, the Arab uprisings 3 years after. A difficult task, but I'll try to make a few points that maybe we could explore further in discussion. I'd say that the Arab world today is, in a sense, trapped in transition. Populations that were rejecting a dysfunctional past, but not yet able to arrive at a functional future. Sort of stuck in the middle, not able effectively to move forward very successfully, and unable to reproduce the patterns of the past. These were states with high political dysfunction, largely one-party states or one-family states, which had restricted political power extensively, had restricted liberties, had become very repressive, at a time when populations were becoming increasingly aware, increasingly networked, and increasingly empowered. These were systems which were also economically becoming very dysfunctional. They were systems that had been put in place in the 50s and 60s. The social contract at the time was, give us your political liberties, we will give you social and economic welfare. Sort of the welfare state model of the 50s and 60s, nationalizing public enterprises, providing public jobs, public welfare, and public services. The states by the 70s and 80s were no longer able to make good on these social and economic promises, the promise to redistribute wealth, partly because the wealth itself had been depleted, and partly because of massive demographic growth. These are populations that are growing very rapidly. The population doubled from 1980 to today. 60% of the population is under 25, so a lot of demand for jobs, for welfare, and so on. As the states were no longer able to make good on these social and economic promises, they did two things. They became increasingly repressive and turned from what began in the 50s as very popular, revolutionary, populist states to police states. They also made concessions to democracy, and beginning in the late 70s or 80s, began to hold what they claimed were elections and parliaments and so on, sort of talking the talk, but not really going forward in any power sharing of any real importance. So great economic dysfunctions, large percentages of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, economic systems which favored the few, kind of a crony capitalist system where there was growth, but the profits were really going to a small group of people. Not enough economic growth in the right sectors to create jobs and relieve pressure. So the tensions of the Arab uprisings were brewing for many, many years. I often compare it to a volcano, a very heavy mountain sitting atop very hot lava. Now that mountain might sit for a year, 5 years, or 20 years, but when something detonates, something happens, this very heavy monolith of a very heavy state can potentially explode. The events of 2010 were partly there were some proximate causes. This was a time of rising food prices, a time of rising fuel prices. As you recall, there was a global economic downturn as well, which impacted jobs and the sort of economic situation in general. But as Ambassador Georgian said, and as we all recall, it was sort of one butterfly event. Bouazizi immolating himself, which created events in Tunisia. Those events in Tunisia then reverberated to Egypt, from Egypt to the rest of the Arab world. So it was also an interesting example where one event can trigger a whole domino effect that can change a region. And it's possible that had not Bouazizi done what he did on that day, we might be sitting 3 years from now without having seen these momentous changes that we did see. The urban secular youth were indeed the vanguard of these events in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, and they played a very important role in cracking that wall of fear and beginning this snowball, which then other social sectors from those countries joined, and the youth became one among much larger and much wider groups. But they played a very critical role, partly facilitated by the social media, which the states were not paying attention to, something they didn't think would really amount to anything, ended up enabling this immense set of events. These uprisings were leaderless. Maybe that gave them some strength initially because they were, in a sense, really populist and really democratic, but it proved that it was eventually perhaps a weakness. At the end of the day, there was no party or political movement that really represented the youth, certainly, or represented the essence of the revolutions or the uprisings. There was no party that took that message, that unified these different groups and demands into one revolutionary set of demands that could then win an election and begin to transform the countries. After the uprisings, after the removal of rulers, and then the hasty organization of elections, it was old parties that had been around for decades that were the most organized and able to take advantage of that electoral moment. And the Islamists, of course, were the best organized and indeed won elections in Egypt, won elections in Tunisia, and did well in other countries as well. The liberals and the secularists, the older liberals and secularists, were also part of the old landscape. They were not really the revolutionary forces themselves. They could not overcome old weaknesses, old divisions. They did not present an alternative to the Islamists, the strong Islamist parties. The young people proved very good at protesting, but not equally adept or not having the time or the experience to organize parties that could go ahead and win elections. The old state elites, which were directly sort of challenged by these uprisings, many of them laid low for a year or two, bided their time, and have found different ways in Egypt and Tunisia, in Yemen, to come back either to dominate or to play important roles in changing and evolving political systems. The uprisings have definitely taken different courses in different countries because each of the conditions are very different. But what is common, and I think what is lasting in all of this, is that the citizens, the people have become empowered, for better or for worse. Some places that's led to civil war, others places it's led to the bringing down of regimes or led to just protests. But this is a different balance of power in the region. These are no longer passive. These are no longer populations that state media can control, at least not in the long run, and that is a new factor in the equation. There were 6 uprisings, as Ambassador Georgian mentioned, in the last 3 years. Of those 6, 1, I think, is succeeding. That's in Tunisia. 1 in Egypt is currently at a critical crossroads, either towards a resumption of transition or reconstruction of authoritarian rule. We'll have to see in the next few months how that goes. 2 of the 6, and those are in Yemen and in Libya, are perhaps inching along in their transitions, but are facing deeper challenges of national unity and state fragility, and I'll come back to that in a moment. 1 in Syria has led to all-out civil war, all-out proxy war also that's brought in powers in the region, and the 6 in Bahrain was aborted fairly quickly by GCC intervention. The uprisings affected mainly republics. Bahrain was the only monarchy to be affected in a major way, but monarchies were also shaken by these new demands and this new mood. In Morocco, the king moved quickly to revise the constitution, to make concessions, to organize elections, and bring in the opposition Islamist party to government, and sort of open the political space and absorb some of the tension that might have happened. In Jordan, the king also encouraged a revision of the constitution, changed the election law, dismissed the government, held fresh elections, appointed a new government. Perhaps not as meaningful as some of the changes in Morocco, but still great awareness that change could come to these monarchies as well. In Saudi Arabia, the king, after coming back from convalescence for medical reasons, one of his first acts upon returning was announcing about $130 billion in 2011 of fresh services, fresh outlays to the population in order to keep alive that social contract that will give you services and goods and jobs, and we will retain political power. The transitions definitely are very, very difficult and troubled in the Arab world. As I've mentioned, although the uprisings were real, they were wide, they were deep, they were profound, but no party has emerged, no leader has emerged, no Mandela, no figurehead has emerged to carry that message. No party has emerged to carry that into fruition. Secondly, although the uprisings were largely triggered by socioeconomic problems, unemployment, social inequality, and so on, there has really been no focus on economic priorities, on what new economic policies need to be taken, what sacrifices need to be made. Although the uprisings were a lot about economics, everything that's happened afterwards and is happening still today is all about politics, politics, and more politics. And the economy is being forgotten. The economies continue to decline in the sense that unemployment is rising, poverty is widening. The problems that brought about the uprisings are certainly getting worse, not getting any better. Thirdly, the regional and international environment in which these Arab transitions occurred have not been helpful or encouraging. Turkey had, in a sense, its own transition in the last couple of decades, as did countries in Central and Eastern Europe. But they had the EU next door, sort of opening its arms to some degree, providing incentives, providing a structure, both economically and politically, to encourage these states to continue their transitions. Nothing of that case exists in the Arab world. In fact, the most powerful states, the most wealthy states in the Arab world were quite alarmed, obviously, by the transitions and in no mood to grant them much encouragement. The West was obviously mired in its own economic crises, and the US withdrawing, suffering financially and economically, and withdrawing from the Middle East, also in no mood to offer any major guidance or help in this way. The uprisings and transitions also got entangled in regional geostrategic problems. Calls for change in Syria triggered sectarian concerns, which then triggered proxy involvement by Iran and Saudi Arabia and turned the whole thing into a sectarian and regional civil war. Calls for reform in Bahrain triggered sectarian tensions, also triggered Saudi, Iranian tensions and caused a succession of events there. The success of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia and Egypt triggered fears that the Muslim Brotherhood might be establishing sort of a regional hegemony with power in Tunisia and Egypt, Hamas in Palestine, potentially Muslim Brotherhood-led rebellion in Syria, strong Islamist or semi-Islamist party in Turkey. This triggered fears in the Gulf that this was some new geostrategic power that had to be confronted and caused reactions there. So these transitions, very difficult domestic conditions, very difficult regional, international conditions, and yet we see a bit of inching forward here and there, and certainly major steps backward in other countries. But transitions historically and in other parts of the world have been definitely complex and difficult. Sometimes they've taken decades, whether one looks at Western history or South America or Asia. It's not unusual that these things go in fits and starts, one step forward, two steps backwards. But I do think that the Arab world is, in a sense, catching up with history. It's clear that Arab populations do want accountable, democratic government of sorts. Whether they will get there tomorrow or next year or next decade, we'll have to see. But this is a sea change in what's happening. It's not a small matter that in the span of 3 years, 4 populations have removed their rulers, who were thought to be almost unshakable. A 5th country is in open revolt against its ruler. 4 countries have engaged in drafting new, generally more liberal and democratic constitutions. 2 have completed that job, 2 are still engaged in it. Also, those 4 have organized fresh elections. Many of those elections were free and fair, not all of them. These are no small accomplishments for 4 countries in a troubled region without much history of it or much domestic support. A few words about the cases. In Tunisia,
Dr. Salem,
yes.
A very few words.
A very few words, all right. All right then. Well, I'll say a few words about Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya. In Tunisia, which is, I think, so far the success story, the factions have managed to step back from the brink. The Islamist movement there has been better led, more moderate than the one in Egypt, has accommodated other factions. They've managed to agree a constitution, form an interim government, and they're about to hold, hopefully, fresh elections to establish a new system. Very promising signs from Tunisia. In Yemen, they are engaged in a serious national dialogue. It's complex, it's troubled, it's taking much longer than perhaps it needed to, but the country has not fallen apart, has not imploded, has not exploded. They're making some progress on resolving the federal and sort of how to distribute the various regions in Yemen. It still has a long way to go, but there's a lot of effort there. In Libya, they sort of had a successful overthrow, but they're left without a state, effectively. So it's a population that liberated itself, but ends up stateless. The population is heavily armed, and obviously that poses serious challenges. But Libya also has not imploded, has not fallen into civil war. There are regional tensions. There are many issues to resolve. But I'm, on the whole, hopeful that Libya will eventually make it. It's a smaller population. They have great oil wealth. They can probably make it. And Egypt, the most complex and perhaps most important case, I will certainly cede to my colleague Khalil, who's an expert on the topic, and give the floor to him.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to thank Ambassador Georgian for inviting us for this event. And it's really a pleasure to be here. This is my first time to visit Texas, so it looks nice so far. Right, so I'll try to give a more focused look at the events in Egypt that happened over the last 3 years. I try to end up with some remarks about the future and what might happen in the future. And let me start first by making this statement about Egyptian politics. If we look at the history of Egyptian politics over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 decades, it used to be dominated by 2 main players or forces. On the one hand, the military, on the second hand, the Muslim Brotherhood. And it has been the case, I would say, even after the revolution that happened in 2011. So going back and look at what happened in January 25th of 2011, many of young Egyptians, they surprised all political parties and forces by what they did. And when they went to Tahrir Square and they revolted and they asked for the very famous slogan, which is freedom, dignity, and social justice. And then, as we saw, because they were not prepared for that moment, they could not organize themselves, and they could not establish political parties that can represent and reflect and materialize their hopes. They ended up more fragmented and more disorganized. And then we found ourselves as Egyptians in the same position, that the only 2 political parties that they are ready to play a role and to take power is the Brotherhood on the one hand and the military on the other hand. And it happened that the Muslim Brotherhood, they took power in June 2012 when President Morsi won the presidential elections. And he sought in the beginning to try to be inclusive. However, because the complexity of the MB as a social movement did not allow him to have such autonomy from the movement. That's why he failed to include as much as secular and liberal forces in Egypt, which ended up with the massive protest that happened in June 30 last year, which led at the end of the day to his removal from power. Since that time until now, Egypt took a very different path when it comes to democracy, when the military removed Morsi, which many Egyptians disagreed with his policy, but at the end of the day, he came through the ballot box. He was freely democratically and freely elected. However, he could not respond to the main goals and the main objectives of the 2011 revolution, and he unfortunately alienated a lot of other political forces. And it used to be said that these are two players, the military and the Brotherhood, used to be the two wings of the counter-revolution, because they are the most conservative two blocks in Egypt. That's why they could not, until now, achieve any of the main goals of the original revolution. And then since that time until now, since last June until now, there has been a roadmap that was imposed by the military, which the timeline of this roadmap is that it should start by revising the 2012 constitution, which was drafted by the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies from the Salafis, and then to have first, I mean, there was no determination whether they should have a presidential or parliamentary elections. And it is likely that the presidential elections will take place before the parliamentary elections. Today and tomorrow, they have a referendum over the constitution. And let me give you a very brief idea about the constitution itself that was amended over the last few months. I would say, generally speaking, there is an improvement in terms of freedoms and in terms of rights of minorities, particularly the Christians and the women. For instance, one of the articles in this amended constitution calls for a good representation of the Coptic minority and for women in the upcoming parliamentary elections. It also gives more right for special needs people. It also protects the freedom of belief. According to one of these articles, is that the freedom of belief is absolute. However, if you look at one of the other articles, indeed, they confine this freedom of belief to only to Abrahamic religions. So it's not open for those who might be atheists or so. So you can find some contradictions in these articles. One of the main drawbacks of this constitution is it gives a lot of power to the military. And this happened that this started indeed on 2012 constitution, when the Brotherhood tried to appease and satisfy the military, so they give them such independence from being controlled by civilian government. So in this constitution, which is, I mean, the voting is taking place on it today and tomorrow, gives a lot of autonomy for the military on the one hand. It also maintains the right of the military to try civilians, which is the military trial for civilians. And also there is no discussion for the budget of the military. So again, we are back in the same position where the military dominates the political life and enshrined its interest in this constitution. As I said, the vote is taking place today and tomorrow. Over the last few weeks, there was no such freedom of speech in Egypt that people can vote against the constitution. Indeed, anyone might show any sign that he is against the constitution. He always depicted by the media that he is a traitor and he is a fifth column and he is agent and he is working against the Egyptian national interest. And this used to be the case over the last few months, unfortunately, that if we look at the majority of those who sparked the revolution of 2011, the majority of them, they are now in prison. If we're talking about the leaders of April 6 movement, Ahmed Maher, for instance, or Muhammad Adil, or other people, they are now in a prison and they got sentenced by 3 years. So this can gives you the sense of the current status of the January revolution. The main issue here now is to what extent the current government and the next one, which is supposed to be in a place within a few months, can include other political parties. And here, this brings me to talk about a little bit about the current situation of the Muslim Brotherhood. And as many of you might know, that the Brotherhood is the most organized and the most strongest movement in Egypt over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 decades. That Mubarak regime did not allow any other political party that can play a strong political role that can counterbalance with the Muslim Brotherhood. As some of you might know, that the Brotherhood was founded in 1928 as a social movement that seeks to reshape the morals and ethics of the society to be more Islamic. And then it started to play politics in 1930s, I would say the late 30s to beginning of 40s. And then they involved in some violent attacks against some officials. They were banned in 1954 under Nasser regime. And they were banned until the beginning of 70s when they came back to political life by the decision of President Sadat, that he sought to counterbalance with the leftist and was Nasserist, and he gave space to the Muslim Brotherhood. Since 1980s until now, the Brotherhood, they renounced violence, of course, and they became an integral part or a player in the Egyptian political scene over the last 3 or 4 decades. And they expanded socially. They have a very strong social network that provides a lot of services, like food, like medical care, like education, particularly for the needy people. So they have this ability to mobilize people and to recruit people and to use them in the elections by voting for their candidates. The Brotherhood did not play, in the beginning of the revolution, they don't play a crucial role in triggering the revolution. In other words, the Brotherhood is a very conservative movement when it comes to ideology, when it comes to their political ideas, which also they reflect the conservatism that exists within the Egyptian society. As I said before, since day one, after the revolution, they sought to co-opt or to contain the revolution. They did not adopt the main goals of the revolution, which mainly political and economic, and they sought to solidify and to consolidate their power by grabbing as much power as they can, and they ended up, of course, as we've seen, by losing power and losing almost everything. If we look at the Egyptian revolution from a very historical perspective, I would say it was unlike a revolution, in which that when it happened, there was no such strong civil society that can mediate between different political forces. And if we compare between Egypt and between Tunis, for instance, Tunis used to have a very strong political society, civil society that can play a role or a mediating role between different political factions. If you look at Egypt, I would say the majority of civil society organizations, particularly those who are close to the political arena, whether they are co-opted by the state or they try to focus on certain issues that might relate to their funding and their finance. The second issue, which also reflects that how much Egyptians were not lucky in having revolution in such time, is the lack of maturity among political forces, particularly among the secular and liberal forces. One of the ironies of Egyptian secular and liberals that instead of trying to build their network and reach out to the society and to create an alternative for the Muslim Brotherhood, they prefer to collaborate with the military to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood, which indeed reflect their lack of faith in genuine democracy or genuine liberalism. So the lack of maturity of the political forces affected the fate of the revolution. The third one is that unlike other Arab countries or Arab societies or Arab political regimes, the Egyptian society has a very strong military, or in other words, it's not that a politically professional military that would confine itself only to its mission, which is to protect the Egyptian national security. The Egyptian military has a lot of stakes in politics and in Egyptian economy. There are many records about the amount of economic interests of Egyptian military. Some people might talk about 30%, others might talk about 40% of the Egyptian economy under the control of the military. And that's why the military has a lot of interest in maintaining its role in political life. The last point that affected the shape and the fate of the Egyptian revolution is the lack of a progressive Islamic movement. In other words, if you compare between the Muslim Brotherhood and between al-Nahda, for instance, in Tunis, they are less progressive than them. Yes, they are peaceful movement, at least until recently. But when it comes to political ideology, as I said in the beginning, they are very conservative political movement, that they don't have such pluralistic worldview or mindset that can include other political forces. These are I would say, the main issues that led to the current state of the Egyptian revolution. The last 2 points is about the future of the political Islam in Egypt, and to what extent they might be modernized and they might be more progressive, or they might be more regressive. I would argue that there are at least three scenarios about the future of political Islam in Egypt. The first one is to reform themselves and to rethink about their mistakes that they did over the last 3 years, which means that to open up their movements and to strengthen the reformist wing that exists, but unfortunately is very weak and very marginalized. However, they cannot be reformed without having the political environment that can encourage them to do that. In other words, if the repression continues as it is right now in Egypt, it is very hard to predict that these people would have the courage to reform and to rethink and to reconsider a lot of their mistakes and a lot of their problems. So you need to create the environment that can encourage them to reform and to take a bold initiative to become more progressive and to be more reformists. The second scenario is radicalization, which means that to move towards extreme and radical ideas. And we can go back and look at the history of the radical movements that emerged in Egypt over the last 4 decades. One of the main reasons behind this is the political repression and the political closure and the limitations that were put by the political system, that they did not allow the political Islam movements to spread their ideas and to be part of the political system. So many of young Islamists now, they lost faith in politics, and they lost faith in democracy, and they lost faith in ballot box, because their argument is that they participated in elections over the last 3 years and they won 5 elections. And overnight or suddenly, these elections were just removed by a military coup, which has happened in July 3rd. This is their argument. So why they should bother themselves by participating in politics again? So the question is, how can the new government bring these people back to politics? How can to convince them that there is a stake and you should regain your faith in politics again? And this is a very huge challenge for the current and the upcoming regime. The last scenario is, which is also can be possible, is the militarization of politics. What I mean by this is that if you follow the discourse of young Islamists now, they think that the only way to deal with the current situation is to stage an Islamic revolution, such as happened in Iran in 1979. And this is the only way for them, all right? And what worries me is that if the regime did not open the space or the public space for these young Egyptians, not particularly Islams indeed, they might end up by this kind of disenchantment, frustration, and even using arms to change the situation. And if you remember, the Syrian revolution started in the beginning as a very peaceful movement, which turned to be very militarized and very armed. The last thing that I'd like to talk about is the challenges that would face the next regime. As I said before, after the referendum on the Constitution, the presidential elections is supposed to take place within 3 months. I would say by April, Egypt should have a new president. And of course, as some of you might know, is that one of the main strongest candidates is the current Ministry of Defense, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Who is very popular now, and he has such kind of charisma that many Egyptians is looking for right now. Regardless who will be the president, I think any new regime would face 3 main challenges or 3 main issues. The first one is political inclusion. To what extent the new government or the new regime would be willing to include as much as young Egyptians in the political process, particularly young Islamists. And this is a big question. The second is how to maintain security. And security is a big issue now in Egypt, not only because the daily protesting that happens every day and the amount of violence that we witness every day in the streets, which tended to be part of Egyptian daily life, that they witness this kind of violent protesting, but also because the situation in Sinai, which is very fragile, and there is no such control over the land of Sinai, and it has a lot of reasons behind this. One of them is the lack of economic development in Sinai and the lack of central government plans there to develop this region, which is it's out of control of the Egyptian state right now. The third and the most important challenge is the socioeconomic situation, which is now very deteriorating and in a very bad shape right now in Egypt. And I can give a very brief figures about the state of Egyptian economy right now. The economic growth rate is around 1.5, which is very low comparing to 7% that used to be before the revolution. The foreign currency reserves is around $17 billion, which is not enough. It barely can cover the imports of Egypt for only 3 months. And of course, it depends heavily on the flow of money that comes from the Gulf to the current government. The unemployment rate is around 13.5, and it's mainly among youth. And this is the main fuel of the revolution. If the new government could not create jobs, I would say Egypt should have every year at least 500,000 jobs that should be created for young Egyptians, which there is about 2/3 of Egyptian population is between 20 to 25 or 30 years old. The inflation rate is around 11.5, whereas there is no
2 minutes.
2 minutes. There is no income, but there is no and there is inflation in the prices. So the underlying reasons that triggered the revolution in the first place is still there, and none of the governments who took power after the revolution could address these issues. And I would say that without addressing the socioeconomic issue in Egypt, we might witness another wave of the revolution, but I would say it might be more bloody and more violent one, because it would be the only way to deal with the current situation. And to end with the positive note, after this, I would say, bleak picture of the Egyptian situation is, I would say, over the last 3 years, Egyptians could remove 3 political regimes. They removed Mubarak, they removed SCAF, which is the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, and they removed Mohamed Morsi. And I would say that they would be able to remove any president that would not fulfill or would not achieve the main goals of the revolution, which is dignity, freedom, and social justice. And we'll end with that note. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Salem, you wrote an article fairly recently that I thought was really interesting and was much more pessimistic actually than your remarks today. And in this article you were assessing not the Arab Spring but the Arab Awakening, which you dated from 100 years ago. And in that article you said that as the Ottoman Empire was in radical decline, there were intellectuals and political movements in the Arab world that were looking to create democracy, equal rights, empowerment of women, and economic development. And that this was impeded by the arrival of the European imperialists after the war, but these movements still existed, and that they were really impaired after World War II when there was independence. And there was two possible results. One was governments that promised these things and became authoritarian. The other was a state like Lebanon, where there was no strong government and where sectarianism and ethnic rivalry led to an effort of one group to dominate another and not to a democratic polity. And what the Arab Spring did in Iraq and in Syria was to get rid of the authoritarian governments, and it led to the fragmentation such as had been existing in Lebanon. And so in this article you actually quote somebody who said that the Arab world is worse off in 2013 than it was 100 years ago when the awakening began. So I thought this was putting this whole subject in a much broader context. And what you did is describe something that is a tragedy. But what I missed out of that article, and what I'd like to ask you today, is why did this happen? What was the reason for the failure that you discuss in this article?
Well, what I do say in that article, what I guess I was getting at, is the mood in the late, we're going back in history now, but relevant history, the mood in the late 19th century and early 20th century in the Arab world, the elites, intellectuals, the political parties that were beginning to be formed, were almost uniformly future-oriented, progressive, inclusive, modernist, hopeful about the future, with a very sort of a strong conviction that they could build together a better future that was modern, democratic, and so on. And that these intellectuals, these elites, played an enormous role in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, in putting forward ideas and visions for the Arab world. One contrast with what's happening today is and of course, I mean, you can look at the situation. One day you can be very pessimistic, and one day be hopeful that maybe some, glass half empty, glass half full. There's much to be pessimistic about, and there's some room for optimism. What's very different today is that you definitely saw something you didn't see 100 years ago, which is the people directly revolting and demanding, accountable government, democracy, social justice. And an elite that was caught unawares, unable to lead, unable to put forward ideas that will stick, and unable to present a credible future to a population that's screaming for it. The parties that exist are either old and retreading ideas, or the vibrant or the powerful forces, at least in the eastern part of the Middle East, this does not really include Tunisia or Libya, not much Egypt, are two, unfortunately, very sort of sectarian powers, Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other, which are presenting, different visions and financing it and organizing it. So I guess what I was getting at in that article indeed was that, and one way I put it sometimes is 100 years ago we had a future. We agreed what it would be. We wanted to achieve it. Maybe we didn't get there, but there was a vision and there was great momentum. Now the people are clamoring for a future, and no party, no leadership, no system is really able to deliver it. Now, what happened over the past 100 years is a long story that
Yes, it is.
we won't go into. But one thing I would say is definitely that, well, one thing I would say is that the success of political systems and political orders takes a long time, building of habits, success and failure, learning from. It's not enough to have the aspiration or have an intellectual put forward a vision that excites a population. It is a much more difficult, much more complex thing that involves power, money, armies, political parties, ability to mobilize, a regional, international environment that encourages it. Unfortunately, today we have a population that is screaming for it, but conditions that are not facilitating it. Now, here we are in the U.S. To what degree, could the U.S. play more or less of a role? As Ambassador Jirijian said, maybe not much. But we are in a world where there is no external power that's helping this come about, and that's certainly one of the worries.
Yeah, I was interested that you didn't blame the European imperialism, you didn't blame American imperialism, you didn't even blame Israel. The implication was that this was really a tragedy that was an Arab tragedy.
I think that's largely the case. And when you look even deeper politics really is a lot about inherited culture. Now, cultures change and evolve, but they're inherited habits of behavior, of exercising power, of exercising submission, of obeying order and obeying laws. The Middle East has had states since the dawn of civilization. It's the oldest. And the states that we've lived with and our fathers, grandfathers and so on, that the inherited culture of politics is indeed very authoritarian. That the models of statehood in our region come from old Persian models, old Byzantine models. We've lived with states for 4,000 or 5,000 years. We have a great inheritance of that, and it's a very authoritarian, a very power-connected sense of what politics is. That politics is whoever has the power. You gravitate towards that. You see it today in Egypt, a will to have a strong ruler that can provide stability and so on. But like all other cultures, all cultures, started with authoritarian government, whether it was royal and so on. It is true that that as economic progress, education, and technology has changed, power has shifted downwards and increasingly towards a more empowered populace. It's true that people today with Google and phones and laptops can no longer be ruled and will never be ruled like they were ruled in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. Other societies went through that at different times and had to learn how to do this kind of politics. So despite the travails of the last 100 years, despite some successes and many failures in the last 3 years, I still think the trajectory of history is going in one direction. And I think if you look at the last 3 years, who would have thought that the Arab populations would have created this massive jump towards demanding this in a major country like Egypt, 90 million, and in Tunisia, Syria is, they were fighting for a more democratic system. Now it descended into civil war, but the demand was very clear. Iraq today is a very dysfunctional place, but it is not what it was, 15 years ago. So I think history is moving in a certain direction, but it's a very messy process. I hope it doesn't make great leaps backwards that are permanent, but I hope these are just growing pains that we all have to live with.
Well, that's encouraging.
Can I just comment on what Paul said about that history takes its way forward, but also we should not also neglect the ability of the new authoritarian elite to co-opt or to contain this growing demand for democracy. For instance, if you look at the situation in Syria, it was very smart from Bashar al-Assad to turn the issue from freedoms and democracy to fighting terrorism, which is also the case in Egypt, that the main discourse now in the streets is not about democracy, it's about how to fight terrorism or how to maintain security. So also authoritarian regimes or autocratic people, they also tend to adapt and to adjust to the new circumstances to maintain their interests. So it's a battle between the new generation
Definitely.
and the old one.
Yeah. Well, I had a question for Dr. al-Anani. This is for the information of the audience and also for me. We know about the military, we know something about the Muslim Brotherhood, but there's another movement there, the Salafis, that we don't know very much about. And I wonder very briefly if you could tell us the role of the Salafis in the current political situation in Egypt.
Absolutely. Well, the Salafi is, I mean, first of all, the Salafi means that the tendency among religious people to go back centuries ago and to interpret Islam and Islamic teachings in a very literal way, very ultra-conservative way. This is a very simplistic definition of Salafism as a political, as a religious ideology. The Salafi movement started in Egypt late 19th century. Was one of the most famous religious scholars called Muhammad Abdu. He used to be one of the most renowned scholars from Al-Azhar University, and he used to lead a very known movement to reform the Egyptian social and political and cultural life. And since that time until now, this trend of Salafism evolved and emerged in Egypt until we reached to the point that the main activity and the main goal of Salafi movement is to reinterpret Islam in a very literal way and in a very conservative way. And they, until recently, they were away from politics. They don't have any interest in playing politics over the last 3 or 4 decades. However, since the 2011 revolution, Salafis divided between whether to participate in political life or maintain their role as a social and as a religious movement. Part of them decided to involve in politics, and they formed something called a Noor Party, and this is one of the most visible Salafi parties now in Egypt. I think there are around 3 or 4 Salafi parties now in Egypt that they play politics, and as well they also continue to play their religious and their social role. Then you also have the passive Salafi movements that they still uninterested in politics and they continue to do what they used to do over the last century. So Salafi is not monolithic. It's a very diverse movement. The question is about the political views of Salafis. Of course, the majority of them, well, before the revolution, indeed, they prohibited any political participation. And they were even against the revolution when it happened in 2011. I would remember one of the most known Salafi leaders, which is now also still playing a very important role, Yasser Burhami. He said that participating in the revolution is haram, is prohibited by Islam. And they have their theological reasoning and theological understanding of this, that it's better for Muslims to have unjust ruler than to have chaotic situation or political problems. So for them, it is better to, as long as the ruler is Muslim, even by name, even if it's not applying Islamic Sharia or Islamic law or Islamic teachings. So for them, politics was something profane, I would say. That's something that they should not have a say on it. But after the revolution, they decided to play a role, and they tried to fill some of the vacuum that was left by the former ruling party, which is the National Democratic Party. since day one, they were inclined to distinguish themselves from the Muslim Brotherhood, to take a distance from the Muslim Brotherhood. If you go back and look at the relationship between the Brotherhood and between the Salafis, it used to be a very confrontational relationship, that they do not get along together over the last 3 decades, and they used to fight each other. They used to compete, and they used to try to dominate the religious sphere and the public sphere in Egypt. That can explain why the Salafi now, or at least the Noor party, is supporting the military now in Egypt, and they're playing a very important role on backing the new government now in Egypt, because they think by crushing the Muslim Brotherhood, they can replace them in the political arena. Second, they believe that the only way to tame and to stop the Muslim Brotherhood is to support the military. The military is the only force that can put limits on the Muslim Brotherhood. However, politically speaking, this can be a risky situation, or risky calculations, because on the one hand, Salafis, they don't have the same structure and the same social network that used to be for the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't have this kind of hierarchical structure that can maintain loyalty and obedience to the leadership. They are more fragmented movement. Second, by siding with the military and with the current regime, they harmed their credibility, because they, at the end of the day, they are standing against another Islamic movement, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, even if they are disagree politically. But their image and their credibility among Islamic forces, I think, were affected and became very negative.
I think that helps us. And it also shows that if you're not in the subject, how much we oversimplify what is really a very complicated political situation. So now it's a turn of the audience. So yes, ma'am.
Unless I did not hear, neither of you gentlemen spoke about the deep, deep divisions within Islam itself. You spoke of Islam as a monolith, but I would like to know how these divisions, the Shiites, the Sunnis, these divisions have harmed the Arab Spring.
Did everybody hear that question?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, I mean, the Sunni-Shia divide today is tearing apart Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Bahrain, Yemen to some degree. But the divide is not, I mean, the conflict is not really sectarian in cause or origin. It is geostrategic between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and some, other GCC countries, I would say. Iran has projected its power into Iraq, backs the Assad government in Syria against most of its population, backs and arms the militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah. The Arab countries, the GCC countries, feel that Iran has vastly overstepped its, what it should be doing, and have reacted in many ways. What we are witnessing now, indeed, is a Sunni-Shia civil war in these three countries, and potentially in some others as well. But the cause of it, and the solution, hence, of it, would be a rapprochement, an agreement, some kind of arrangement between the large petrostates, which are mobilizing, financing, which are effectively Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia and some others on the other. I grew up in Beirut, which is a mixed city. Sunnis and Shiites have been living together in the Levant for centuries. I grew up in Beirut. Nobody would think to ask who was Sunni, who was Shia. It was not politicized. It had no meaning because there was nobody behind it. There was nothing really taking place there. So yes, this is, in other words, it's not a religious issue and it's not a religious divide. It's an identity divide, which unfortunately is linked to two regional powers who are slugging it out across the Middle East. This has gotten worse. Well, I mean, the U.S. had, you know, is a major player in the Middle East. The U.S. has been in conflict with Iran since 1979. The GCC countries have been U.S. allies for decades. The U.S. certainly, you know, has been working for decades for either containing Iran or regime change in Iran or axis of evil Iran and so on, and also encouraged Arab states and GCC to line up, you know, against Iran and so on. Iran reacted to that and has been over-aggressive in its response. So we have in the eastern part of the Middle East a conflict system which has been established over the last 3 decades. The U.S. is now pulling out and has left Iran and the GCC states sort of to work it out. On a positive note, I think that you know, the latest interim agreement between the P5+1 and Iran on the nuclear issue, if that leads to a permanent agreement over the nuclear issue, and if that leads then to a rapprochement between the US and Iran, that could be an entry point to begin to normalize Iran's presence in the region, to de-escalate the Iranian deployment, which is throughout the Middle East, and to try to build peace between Iran and the Arab countries. We didn't mention Israel and Palestine much today because there is no longer really an Arab-Israeli conflict. There is an Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's very significant for the Palestinians. They need a homeland, they need a state, they need a life. But the eastern part of the Middle East is in an Arab-Iranian conflict, not in an Arab-Israeli conflict. That needs to be addressed. And Egypt and North Africa is really in an Islamist secular conflict and not really having much to do with the rest.
Can I add just something here also? Good. I think Paul talked about the high level of the sectarian issue, to what extent it might affect the Arab Spring, but also we should not also overlook what's happening on the bottom level in terms of what I'm calling this kind of religious blackmail between different religious movements. In other words, if you look at the, as I mentioned briefly before, the tendency among Salafis to blackmail the Muslim Brotherhood. One of the main reasons behind the conservatism of the Muslim Brotherhood is they don't want to lose their constituency by giving more ideological concessions. That's why they maintain their conservative ideology when they play politics. It's the same case also in Tunisia. I mean, one of the main conflicts now in Tunisia is between the Salafi and between the Nahda. And it's almost over politics, over ideology, over the political system. So we cannot ignore or overlook this kind of low-level divide between different Islamic forces.
Yes, sir.
In the youth population that's been involved in the Arab Spring, particularly kind of they've been used as kind of the vehicles for it, and their level of whether or not they're actually informed participants. Do they understand the cause of their participation and the potential consequences, or are they just caught up in the populistic fervor of the events and possibly just fall in the leads of their peers?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think those young people who made the Arab Spring were such naive to believe that this would be a very short battle. They realized from day one that this is going to be a very tough battle. It's not only against such autocratic regimes, but it's also against this kind of old mindset, old generation. And if you look at the Egyptian case, for instance, the real battle is not between political parties, but between the old generation that is still dominating everything and the young generation. One of the ironic things that happened after the revolution, that the second prime minister in Egypt, he was Kamal al-Ganzouri, he used to be prime minister under Mubarak. And they did not find anyone else but him to give him the position to be a prime minister, which disappointed a lot of young people. So I think they understand very well that the battle is not easy, and they continue to sacrifice for this. However, if we look at the the strategy of the new elite or the new regime, it is mainly directed toward this, distorting and demonizing these people. If you look at Egypt right now, the main figures of January Revolution, they are in prison now, as I said in my presentation. I'm Ahmed Maher, Mohammed Adil, Ahmed Doma, other people, Isra Abdel Fattah. Isra Abdel Fattah, she was attacked today when she was voting in the elections, and she was under attack from people. People accused her by being a traitor, an agent for the West, and they get money from the West. So this is the discourse of the new regime now against the January Revolution. However, they still believe that they can achieve their goals. That's why they continue to go to the streets every day and to pay the price for change. So I will not lose hope in the young Arab people.
One more. Osama.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the speakers to.
Hi. Good to see you.
More clearly and sharply about the U.S. the legacy, without blaming. If we don't want to use the word language of blame, as Alan said, the legacy of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, which has seen the U.S. support the most anti-democratic forces in the region, the Saudi monarchy, Israel, and of course the Egyptian military, the $1.5 billion, which I think they today renewed, where they're sending out again. And so I'm wondering how you can think about that and then tell me that we cannot analyze that or take that seriously as part of trying to make sense of the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, the failures or the persistence of autocracy in this region, when the very region was not created by Arab tradition, but of course by, as we know, Western powers.
Well, let me say a number of things. I would say that the region, the patterns of politics, and our patterns of politics, and I've myself been involved in Lebanese politics and lived other politics. This wasn't a region that was invented. Yes, certain states were, certainly in the east, certain borders and so on, but the conclusion that this was an invented set of political orders misses one part of the story, which is, there's very deep and tradition, and I'm not saying culture, culture by nature changes and by definition changes. The U.S. had slavery, people work through their issues, but the past does weigh heavily. The U.S., I think, in discrete areas, the U.S. certainly helped end the French, World War II, and there was a role there, and the U.S. was initially regarded very positively, as as sort of a more promising land than these, French and British colonialists. Support for Israel had a direct effect, certainly, in the responses that took place in Egypt and in Syria and Iraq, the militarization that, with the establishment of Israel, which was, the main driving issue at that time. It was very legitimate or popular to militarize the state in order to face the challenge of Israel. And this created, the legitimization or the excuse for setting up military regimes in all of these states. And we've been living with that legacy for a long time. The U.S. and the Soviets in the Cold War certainly supported whoever was around. Most of them had become authoritarian regimes for many reasons. Some were not. Lebanon was not. They supported Lebanon as well. The Soviets had their friends. The Americans had their friends. And certainly that was one of the reasons why the order survived for so long, because they had two major patrons. There was hope, as you remember, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Central and Eastern Europe was turning democratic. That was really the beginning in the Arab world of the movement, which I would say ended up in 2010 and 2011. Most of the revolutionary forces in the region were in the 50s and 60s, as you know, leftists, socialists, communists, and so on. When the leftist dream died and when democracy, as it were, broke out in Central and Eastern Europe in such a positive way, and I experienced it in Lebanon, I experienced it with colleagues in Egypt, in Yemen, in Jordan, in Tunisia, in Morocco and other places. That was the beginning of a movement in the region among young people, civil society and so on, to talk about democracy and to bring that to the fore. The Islamists began to take democracy more seriously and moved their position from really not taking it very seriously to, by the end of the past decade, taking it very seriously. The last, big event was the toppling of the Saddam regime. That had a major impact on the geostrategic and hence semi-sectarian balance in the region, and really ignited this Sunni panic about Shiite power and the Shiite crescent and all of that. And I think that act in 2003, we're still paying, we're still living in the aftermath, the repercussions of that major geostrategic sort of sectarian shift, which the Gulf countries have not adjusted to. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And Iran hasn't figured out, how far it should extend its influence and so on. But I would say at the end of the day, as an Arab and as somebody who's been involved in this, in politics, in activism, and with others in the region, the bulk of the responsibility is our own. There are major factors, external, they are important, but they are not fate. And I do think that, for example, what's happening in Egypt today, it's Egyptian decision-making, Egyptian military, at the end of the day, I think, that it's what we and the various players in our countries do, and what we make of our own societies and our own future. I don't think that the outside world can ultimately determine, how we live.
Can we thank the panelists?
Thank you.